Professor Elizabeth Jeffreys, who's been a great ally and friend of this organisation for a long time, and has come from Oxford, from her great experience with Byzantine and modern Greek language and literature, to talk with us about poetry as prayer within the Orthodox Christian tradition. And those of us who have the privilege of listening to the services on the Holy Mountain in a language which we don't necessarily immediately understand at one level of our mind, will of course notice the deeply poetic character, I speak for myself, of Orthodox liturgy, and of course this very subtle partnership with music, which we shall be hearing a bit more about today. So this does open up and remind us of a very important dimension in the articulation of faith within that tradition, at every level, both at liturgical and at humbler levels as well. So without more ado, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and thank you, organisers, for, I look around for Graham in particular, for inviting me to participate in this conference. Now, can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Right, good. On the face of it, the topic on which I've been asked to provide some thoughts should be straightforward, a matter of looking at some classic literary examples of Orthodox piety, from such well-known names as Gregory of Nazianzus, Romanos the Melod, Cassia, John of Damascus, and so forth, and exclaiming over their excellent qualities. But that approach is too simplistic. In the context of this conference on the life of prayer of the Athonite monks, I've taken it that this paper is tasked with considering a fundamental matter in the construction of prayers, the role of words, or to put it another way, to take a literary approach. Arguably, without words, whether vocalized audibly or internalized silently, prayer cannot exist, though last night Father Stephen was telling us that, in fact, silence can be as articulate as words when it comes to prayer. In certain forms of presentation, we call sequences of words poetry, and I'll come back to definitions of poetry in a moment. Again, in the context of this conference, we can look for poetry in prayer in, for example, texts that were brought to the Holy Mountain, the liturgical prayers which I had hoped were going to be discussed by Father Maximus in the last session, have many poetic elements, and they are prime instances of these, though I'm not going to be discussing them further. So I'm afraid if you've been looking for liturgical poetry, tough. Or we can look for poetic texts composed on the Holy Mountain itself, of which there are relatively few, as far as I can see, for various reasons, some of which will appear later. Or we can look for other cases of devotional poetry which would have been used in both lay and monastic environments. I'm going to be focusing on texts which have monastic connections, of which copies may well be found in the Athonite libraries, but which were more often than not composed elsewhere in the Orthodox world, if only because the monasteries on the Holy Mountain did not come into existence until the mid-9th century, and many relevant texts date from earlier periods. Most prayerful texts are preserved in manuscripts, but a significant number are dedicatory prayers inscribed on objects by worshippers, and these inscriptions include personal devotional elements in the offerings that are being made. And now perhaps you can permit me a rather different personal note of my own. You might have been concluding from my remarks so far that I come to this topic as a medievalist, a Byzantinist. And the examples I shall be using are all composed in Byzantine Greek, and most of those that I've selected for today were written by the 13th century. And so I skirt around hesychasm and its textual environment. And by choosing texts in Byzantine Greek, I am, of course, ignoring the Russian tradition and the Syrian tradition of orthodoxy. I trust you forgive me for that, but there's quite enough in the Greek to keep everybody very happy. But to revert to definitions of poetry, what do we mean by poetry? The English language makes a useful distinction between verse and poetry. Verse can be defined as, for example, a metrical line containing a definite number of feet, a metrical composition, while poetry is art, the work of the poet, the elevated expression of elevated thought or feeling in metrical form. Now, those are dictionary definitions. In English today, poetry and poetic remain terms redolent with overtones from romanticism. Poetry is the verbal framework within which to emote, to make personal statements, to demonstrate personal feeling. But what actually makes a text poetic is a matter for debate, and one which is a subject for considerable theoretical argument. Is it indeed the text's form, the presence of a metrical pattern? Is it a particularity of vocabulary or syntax? Is it a density of expression? Or is it indeed an emotional tone? A Byzantine author would have accepted all of these as necessary markers of a poetic text, except in most circumstances for the last. Emotion was not an essential element in Byzantine poetry. And indeed, virtually everything that could be expressed in prose by Byzantine writers was also expressed in verse, in a metrical form. Texts in verse range from rhetorical handbooks to imperial encomia to canon law to treatises on how to build a siege engine. Questions to ask then are, why was this so? And does it have any relevance to personal prayers? Why did some authors choose to express their thoughts in metrical patterns rather than in less demanding, relatively unstructured prose? A quick background comment on Byzantine Greek and Byzantine metrics. Greek is a living language with a long history. Languages evolve. By the time the Athonite monasteries were functioning, the vowel and consonant values that made up the syllable quantities in ancient Greek had been replaced by the modern stress accents and phonetics. This made verse compositions, metrical compositions, using the ancient rules extraordinarily demanding. Simplified metrical structures were emerging, notably the 12-syllable line replacing the iambic trimeter, and the 15-syllable line, which in effect replaced the hexameter. However, use of even these simplified structures required considerable practice over years of education, years which were not open to many, and in fact education generally in the medieval Greek world was very restricted. While those to whom the opportunity was available for long enjoyed the intellectual challenges of fitting square pegs in round holes, that is, in attempting to write verse which combined both the ancient and the modern, i.e. medieval, phonetic and stress systems. Furthermore, Byzantine linguistic snobbery inhibited the use of vernacular forms in written compositions and gave an extra cachet to those who could demonstrate mastery of metrical complexities combined with a high written style. This is part of the answer to why unlikely material could be presented in metrical form, for it demonstrates the writer's skill and claims status for the text as well as for the writer. And it perhaps also accounts for at least part of my perception that relatively few poetic texts were produced on the Holy Mountain. However, this statement applies particularly to texts using the 12-syllable line, which has its clear antecedents in the ancient iambic trimeter. The 15-syllable line had no such history, and its use was often deprecated by those who nevertheless used it, though there was a sense that its apparent simplicity was a token of sincerity. Enough of that. Now, for a little more on the types of prayer that I propose to discuss. Father Stephen opened the conference with some very comprehensive suggestions on the types of prayer and gave a very helpful survey. And liturgical poetry, we have to, I'm sorry to harp on that. I was looking forward to hearing about liturgical poetry. the sort that can be found in Kontakia and canons. In any general definition, I think one can say that prayer places the person uttering it into the presence of God. Thinking, speaking, listening, using praise, petition, thanks, confession, penitence, compunction. Many such prayers of praise, petition, thanks, confession, as well as referencing the mundane anxieties of every life, are also dealing with the spiritual, of course, and many of these are to be found in Echologia. These, the Echologia collections of prayers, have a complex compilation and publishing history, which is now being explored in a project at the University of Vienna, directed by Professor Claudia Rack. But of course, many such prayers can be found outside Echologia, many in the Horologium, but many also in manuscript anthologies, such as the Anthologia Barbarina, or added into margins of manuscripts, such as the Bodleian Psalter Clark 15, recently studied by Mark Laugsterman. Or they can be gathered up in collections of the poetic works of individual writers, such as John Geometries. I'm going to start on a mundane level with some remarks on prayers for events in everyday life, and then move on to an example of praise, then prayers of compunction, and end with prayers embedded in dedicatory epigrams. Prayers for events in everyday life, secular or monastic. My Byzantine encounters with such prayers have come from browsing through Goar's Echologium, first published in 1647, with its multitude of prayers on every imaginable occasion, for times of drought, for sailors on setting out to sea, for safety in times of war, on a child's first haircut, for a prosperous harvest. The harvest that is being garnered by the Vienna Prayer Book project I mentioned just now suggests that it is likely to provide many sociological insights into the preoccupations of Orthodox society in the middle centuries of the last millennium, as the divine is invoked to support the everyday. For now, I would like simply to present a straightforward prayer in a monastic context for a good night's sleep. It comes from one of the great figures of Greek monasticism, Theodore of Studius, or Theodore the Studite, who lived 759 to 826, who came from a family steeped in monasticism. His uncle was an abbot of one of the major monasteries of the period. Theodore was a vehement advocate of monastic discipline, who made the Studios monastery in Constantinople one of the monastic powerhouses, leading opposition to iconoclasm and developing an influential monastic rule. This rule was focused on a life of prayerful activity, based on disciplined, practical tasks in the garden, the scriptorium, the kitchen, the choir. Discipline was vital. In contrast to his theological discourses, the prayer I quote now is simple. It comes from his collection of iambic epigrams that reflected on many aspects of monastic life. This one seems to have been intended to be painted on the wall of a dormitory, or perhaps a cell. Others in the collection were intended for refectory walls. Next slide, please. Now, I've given the Greek to start off with, and then the English next, and I have terrible problems working out sizes. I do hope the English is legible. So, on the bedchamber. You who bestow sleep as a release from the toils of day, may you grant me too, my Christ, word of God, sleep that is light, sweet, and swift to come, that drives away evil apparitions and is full of pleasant dreams. And when the Simantron sounds, may you arouse me entire and ready to chant cheerfully, as you direct my feet firmly towards praise, shielding my thoughts from the wiles of devils, and tuning my tongue to sing harmoniously to the glory and praise of your great might. So that having passed the night in tranquility and waking at dawn, I may see the light of your commands at the break of day. So, this is a straightforward, tranquil prayer, pointing its reader or readers, communal or individual, to a life of praise and harmony as they internalise these words, either through their ears as the words are articulated audibly, or through their eyes as the words are read silently. Now, I was very interested last night when Father Stevens stressed that prayer, private prayer in Orthodox surroundings, isn't necessarily individualistic and private. It's still communal. Now, a point I'm going to be making in this paper is that one can see a shift which reflects a wider European movement in the later Middle Ages towards the articulation of the individual and removing him or her from their communal surroundings. I turn from a renowned monastic figure from the Byzantine Middle Ages to one who spent his last years a monastic, though this is not necessarily the aspect of his life for which he is most renowned. This is John Geometres. Living in the latter half of the 10th century, he died sometime around the year 1000, Geometres exemplifies some of the points I've been making about language use. Coming from an elite family, he received a good education and became a major literary figure, composing rhetorical treatises, epigrams, and verse reflections on contemporary life. He combined this with a distinguished military career in a turbulent period that was marked by wars with Bulgaria and an imperial assassination. Dismissed from active service by the Emperor Basil around the year 985, he retired to a monastery in Constantinople, where he seems to have written most of his religious works. Throughout his life, Geometres expressed heartfelt devotion to the Virgin. Amongst his most striking works are his 5 hymns to the Virgin. His praise and gratitude for her care are expressed in sequences of Heretis Me. Next slide, please. I quote a passage from the 4th of his hymns. Hail, thou that art the fount of grace, moving the heart of the merciful God, that he may not pass judgment. Hail, thou that save wretched mortals from the just anger and wrath of the Almighty Creator. Hail, thou that raised the creation when, flogged like a servant, it already falls to the ground. Hail, thou that in open fight expel even ferocious demons from the breath of our bodies. Hail, thou that art the remedy against myriad incurable ailments, and bring souls back from the netherworld to the light of day. Hail, thou that turn away the soul-snatching angels, and give swift respite to us ephemeral beings. Hail, thou that weep over human frailties, and welcome the tears of repenting sinners. Hail, thou that like a fresh sponge wipe clean the diabolically dense pages of sinfulness. We should note the form of this hymn. I did warn people that I'm a rather pragmatic approach to these texts. Geometres is using elegiac couplets. That is, a hexameter followed by a pentameter, and he's combining the ancient, standard ancient pattern with vocabulary which acknowledges stress accents rather than the ancient quantities. But he also uses some very archaic forms like the philo-ikistio in the first line, and these are there to make the meter work. This is Geometres, the major literary figure, demonstrating his professional skills, though he himself claims other motives. In a short epigram after the 3rd hymn, he justifies his choice of elegiac couplets by arguing that the 6 feet of the hexameter and the 4 complete feet of the pentameter provide 10 perfect dactyls, that's feet with 2 solid stresses in them, and that 10 is the perfect number because the first letter of the name Jesus is iota, that is the number 10. Now, one might wonder whether this is genuine justification or an elaborate sophistry. It's probably actually a bit of both. That aside, what might be the response of his hearers or readers to this passage? Is the intended audience for these Heretis Me the Virgin alone? Or is it the Virgin and Geometres as he utters her praises? Or is there a congregation who is to hear, comprehend, and join in the moment of praise? In this hymn, there is no refrain, but in the first three of Geometry's hymns, there are refrains, suggesting that a congregational response was anticipated. Geometries is often referred to with the epithet Kyriatis, which until recently has been assumed to refer to the Church of the Virgin that used to stand in the district of Constantinople named Tarkiru, that is, the district which once housed the palace of Kyros, prefect of Constantinople in 435. Kyros was a considerable poet, and it has been assumed that this church had provided Geometris with his monastic residence, hence he was Kyriotes, as Theodore of Studius was Studites. Paul Magdaleno, however, has recently demonstrated that in fact, probably prompted by this church's connections to Romanos the Melode in the 6th century, it was in that church that he received his vision which started his poetic composition, there had continued to function a confraternity of lay and monastics who venerated the Virgin with hymns, encomia, and night vigils. The literary tradition established in the 5th century by Kyros, and Romanos in the 6th had set a high literary standard, which indeed lingered on into the 12th century, though not always at such an elevated level, more verse than poetry, as we shall see. Geometry's hymns to the Virgin, to whom he expressed devotion throughout his life, were thus composed at a high level of language sophistication for an elite group of Constantinopolitan devotees rather than a monastic community, despite his own monastic calling. Let us note the tone of the Kyrios me. The Virgin is hailed as the fount of grace and as the intercessor for sinful humankind. It is she who raises humanity when it quakes under God's justified chastisement. She chases away the soul-snatching angels who hover at the moment of death, bringing swift respite to us ephemeral beings. We should note the plural us. Geometries is expressing compunction and penitence, not so much as an individual, but rather as a member of the human race, the mass of fallen humanity. The tears of compunction that he sheds are those of all repenting sinners, not his as a lone, isolated being. The debate over when individuals began to perceive an individual identity for themselves, as I was suggesting just now, has rumbled on over the last several decades. Was it in the 12th century? Was it not until the Renaissance? Byzantine prayers offer insights into the process which I think ought to be brought into the wider debate. Compunction and penitence indeed form a major theme of Byzantine personal devotional poetry, both monastic and lay. At the most basic level, these sentiments are prompted by awareness of mortality and fears for the Last Judgment, combined with a recollection of human sinfulness caused by the original sin of Adam and Eve that led to their fall and expulsion from paradise. These fears are often expressed in what are known as catalytic alphabets, catalytic from the Greek katanixis or compunction. So penitential alphabets is the more sensible term. These are usually made up of couplets, though units of 3 lines are also found, and the units are linked by an alphabetic acrostic, so that each poem contains 24 units. What is perhaps the earliest example, next slide please, comes from Simeon Metaphrastes. He is best known as the compiler, at the behest of the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, died 959, of a 10-volume Menologium, in which he revised and standardized linguistically a large number of saints' lives. In other words, he subjected them to a metaphrasis, a metaphrastic process that transformed them from a variety of styles into one that was uniform. And it's his version of saints' lives which are most commonly read today. So, let us look at the opening of the Metaphrastes penitential alphabet. Tears from my eyes, pain from my heart, repentance from my soul, these I offer to you, my Creator. My lustful acts have now become barbs, my lusts have turned into grievous pains. Humankind is prone to slip into sin, I know, but woe is me, I have run to it faster than even an animal would. Come hither, compassionate souls, shed showers of tears over a most lamentable soul. I say in all honesty, Christ, if your goodness prevails over boundless evil, let it show itself to me now. How much better it is to die than to live in such sin. It would have been better for me not to have been born at all. I lift up my eyes of my heart unto you, Lord. I cry bitterly, have mercy. All hope is gone. O death, the thought of you is bitter for mankind, but more than death, it is the hereafter that consumes my thoughts. Now, in the Greek text up on the screen, I've marked the letters of the acrostic in bold, so that you can see it really does work, alpha, beta, gamma, and so on. But the translator, my colleague, Mark Lauxman, sensibly does not attempt to reflect this in the English version. Tears are present from the outset, a marker of the poet's anguish and a sign of his repentance. Perhaps as a result of the rise of academic interest in the history of the emotions, recent studies of these and other penitential texts, by, for example, Hannah Hunt, have highlighted the significance of tears as a sign of deep, genuine feelings. In this extract, the tears come from the speaker, but are also summoned from kindred souls, those round him, who feel compassion for him. But it's not clear whether they too are clamouring for mercy for themselves, though all mankind is included in the bitterness of the thought of death. So, continuing the question about the development of an individual sense of the person rather than a collective one, this passage makes an individual howl of sorrow, I cry bitterly, have mercy, but then moves on swiftly to cover the wider community. In the current preoccupation with gender-neutral vocabulary, this extract offers two terms for all humanity, translated as humankind in the gamma couplet, hienos vroton, and mankind, anthropis, in the theta couplet. And I'm sure that Simeon meant both to cover all humanity, regardless of gender. This is perhaps the earliest of these penitential alphabets to survive, and intriguingly, it is also one of the earliest texts to use the 15-syllable line, 15-syllable verse, for a significant number of consecutive lines. Now, that statement conceals a lengthy philological controversy. All that is relevant here is that this is an important moment in medieval and modern Greek metrics, with the birth of what became the dominant metre for verse in Greek right up until the latter years of the 20th century. It's a metre which follows the natural stresses of the modern language and is infinitely easier to manipulate than the elegiac couplets used by Geometres, Simeon's contemporary. So, what lessons can be drawn from the contrast in metrical choices by Geometres and the metaphrast? Modern commentators attribute connotations of sincerity, as I have suggested, to the 15-syllable line. Whether that was the view of its medieval exponents is a moot point. I'm sure that Geometres was as sincere in his praises and his compunction as Simeon was in his repentance. It's surely a matter of context and expectations. Geometres was composing for a city confraternity and drawing on his rhetorical training. Simeon was focusing on a less erudite congregation. And it's worth noting that it's possible that these alphabets were set to music, in which case they would have been appropriate for congregational use as well as by individuals. More or less contemporaneous with Metaphrastes' alphabet, but using sets of 3 lines rather than 2, is the alphabet by Nikephoros Ouranos, died 1007. And Ouranos, like Geometres, was a successful general in the Bulgarian Wars of the second half of the 10th century, though he also held the office of Canicleus, or imperial secretary, literally keeper of the inkwell. He is the author of a manual of military tactics, as well as several saints' lives, but he didn't function at the same elevated literary level as Geometres. Interestingly, he also served as a lay guardian for the Lapra monastery on Athos. His alphabet was widely copied and much used. Next slide, please. I quote, "What words shall I offer you from my lips? Word. How shall I cast my eyes to the heights of heaven when I am besmirched by my deeds and am utterly filthy? I know, Lord, that I am a burden on the earth. I pollute the air. But why does a chasm not gape open? Why is there no thunderbolt from above? Your patience, your forbearance is so great. The perversity of my mind, the lust of my soul, cannot be numbered by the stars above nor the grains on the sea shore, as I stand self-condemned before the judgment seat. Dreadful are the torments on that day, but not equal to my trespasses. Wherefore, my Christ, I stand in fear and trembling before that doom. I, my Saviour, have betrayed you treacherously to your enemies. I have set you, my benevolent Lord, on the cross. I have been more cruel to you than Judas. Life's harvest draws near, for the land is white, and death has already prepared the sickle. But you, dissolute soul, what will you do, unrepentant as you are? The days which I wasted, that I spent in sin, no one will restore. So restore them to me so that I may correct my ways. So what fountains of tears can suffice for me?" The speaker is in fear and trembling as he contemplates his sins and his unworthiness and releases floods of tears. But whereas in the metaphrast penitential alphabet the communal identity is referenced, for Uranus, the individual is dominant. The poet's I, the first person, is only enhanced by his apostrophizing of his dissolute soul. But you, dissolute soul, what will you do? A version of this text is found in an Athonite manuscript, Dionysiou 65, a mid-12th century manuscript which contains a psalter, followed by a selection of theological material, including works of Basil of Caesarea and Maximus the Confessor. Next slide, please. It was made for a certain Savas, a monk from a town in the Bay of Nicomedia, near Constantinople. The book opens with a series of images relevant to stages in a monk's progress through life, the concluding ones of which are accompanied by selected strophes from Uranos's penitential alphabet. Yogi Parpulov, whose knowledge of the manuscripts of Byzantine psalters and devotional texts is unrivaled, considers this the most personal response to a text that he is aware of in Byzantine art. And this is just the first of the sequence of 6 which come. The image on the screen shows the beginning of the monk's final hours as the angel receives his soul, and the soul in the lower register is led to Hades. The black figure on the left of the upper scene must be Savas. But what is striking about these images, and the whole illustrated first segment of the book, which also has pictures of Christ, the Holy Virgin, and the apostles. What is striking about this is that its images were made by the most renowned book illuminator working in Constantinople in the middle years of the 12th century, a painter referred to currently as the Coquin of Athos master, because of some other texts which he illustrated. So this was a costly book which seems to have had a complex history. At what stage in his life Savas commissioned it is not clear, nor is it known how it came to the Moni Dionysiou. But it's a demonstration of the which manuscripts can relocate and the difficulty of drawing conclusions from the current presence or absence of texts from a given location, and also the difficulty of concluding what materials were and were not available in monastic environments. Now, let me turn briefly to the figure who perhaps comes most immediately to mind when considering prayer and poetry in a monastic context, Simeon the New Theologian. Born in 949, and coming like Geometres from an elite family and receiving a better education than his later pleas of illiterate ignorance would suggest, Simeon turned away from a place at court and entered the studious monastery. He was subsequently appointed igumen of the monastery of St. Mamas on the Golden Horn in Constantinople, but fell out with his monks, perhaps for the strict discipline he exercised, and perhaps also for his continued veneration of his spiritual father. He was exiled, but later recalled and allowed to build a monastery. The corpus of his writings, in both prose and verse, which survives, is extensive. Homilies, theological discourses of many kinds, and of course, his hymns, the hymns of divine loves, ton theon hymnon I erotes. His writings have been hugely influential, though not, it would seem, in his lifetime. They would appear not to have circulated widely, even in Constantinople itself, and even when his disciple Nikitas Athos had collected and prepared them for a wider group. Nikitas, it would seem, retained a sense that much that Simeon wrote was too daring for those who had not been initiated into his thought world. Nevertheless, his teaching stimulated the hesychast movement of the 14th century, which Palamas initiated in his early years in Athonite monasteries. And Simeon's words were behind the hesychast revival of the late 18th century, of which the Philokalia, compiled by Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, is emblematic. I want to make 3 points about Simeon's poetry. It is 1, mystical, revealing his rapturous encounters with the divine light. 2, it's penitential, lamenting his great unworthiness as a recipient of divine love. And 3, it is at times shocking in its blending of the physical with the spiritual. For example, with its use of erotic terms, often derived from the Song of Songs, and with its gender reversal. Rashly, I suggest, next slide please, that these themes can all be perceived in the following short extract from hymn 16. But in the hour of my distress, when I begin to weep, then he shows himself and sees me, he who sees all. I wonder and marvel at the splendour of his beauty, and how he, my Creator, opened the heavens, leant out, and showed me his glory, ineffable and wondrous. Who can get closer to him, and how can one be lifted up to such a height? Yet, in the midst of these thoughts, there he is, within me, radiating from within my miserable heart, shining all around me with divine luminosity, and suffusing my whole body with his rays of light. He embraces me wholly, he kisses me all over, he gives himself fully to me, although I am not worthy. I'm filled with his love and his beauty. I'm full of pleasure and divine sweetness. I share in his light, I partake of his glory. My face shines like that of my loved one, and all my members become luminous. Simeon weeps in penitential sorrow. He is irradiated by the Creator's divine luminosity, and he is embraced and kissed all over, filled with his love and beauty. He partakes in the divine glory, and it is passages like these that Stephatos must have felt were not appropriate for those beyond the mystic's immediate circle. In the context of the discussion whether there is a communal or individual identity, it is not surprising that while he may subsume his sinfulness within the failings of all mankind, Simeon uses the first person singular of his experiences of the divine. This passage is firmly I. The intensity of his outpourings of prayers of praise and penitence can never be viewed as a generic expression of group emotion. Now, that's a totally inadequate summing up of Simeon the New Theologian. His poetry is of a completely different order to the rest of the texts I have been presenting to you. These, even geometries, are the daily bread of prayerful discourse, or prayerful discourse in monastic life, whereas Simeon the New Theologian offers a rich and abundant feast, and perhaps for many a rather indigestible feast. This is poetry and not verse. Now, from the sublime to something else, from poetry to verse. Let us turn to my last set of examples. 2 dedicatory epigrams on holy objects, where the nature of the speaking I of the verse is problematical. Next slide. The first of these takes us away from the monastic sphere to a worldly environment, but represents a phenomenon which is widespread in both contexts, where cult objects are dedicated to a holy personage. So I quote, "If there exists a river and rushing streams, then these are here and God's golden city. For your womb is the city of God who became man, and the river likewise is the living, indwelling spirit, and an onset of streams, a flood of delights. So I have found you to be God's golden city, a precinct which gives protection from death. For if your right hand had not protected my branch of the Porphyrogenitus tree, badly wounded as he was by a spear in his eye and approaching the gates of death, the chill of death would perhaps now have held him, and I have been filled, but thus I have been filled with your benefactions. I make supplication again on behalf of my absent son. Grant to my emperor breadth of rule, and give him power over the barbarians. And for my grapes, which now have flourished, increase still more the sovereign's warmth. Irene pleads with you for this petition, wife of the Sevastocrator Andronicus." Right, there's some phrases there which seem a bit odd, but I hope to explain. This text, entitled "Other Verses on a Holy Inherion of the Most Holy Theotokos in Tarkiou," produced by the Sevastocratorissa, is a prayer made to the Holy Virgin in about 1149 by a high-status lady who had fallen under imperial disfavour. In fact, it brings us back to an environment we encountered at the outset of this paper, and is one of the texts that demonstrate the potential continuity of the literary confraternity of the church which gave Geometres his epithet Hieriotes. The Sevastocratorissa, that means the wife of the Sevastocrator, who was at this period, the son of one of the reigning emperor. The Sevastocratorissa is presenting a veil to cover an icon of the Virgin in the church of Tarkiou in Constantinople. It's an action as a token of devotion and gratitude for the Virgin's past protection of Irene's son, who had been gravely wounded in the battle. He lost an eye, in fact, as you might gather from the spear mentioned. And it is Irene's son who is the branch of the Porphyrogenitus tree, his father having been a Porphyrogenitus, i.e. born in the chamber of the Porphyra, and a son of the reigning emperor. In the rather florid terminology used in court encomium at this period, this is quite a normal way to refer to a member of the family. So he's the branch of the tree. And the text is also a plea for future support for Irene and her family in Irene's troubled relations with the emperor. Irene is pleading for the Virgin to intercede with the emperor on Irene's behalf. So we've got here a bargain being struck between a suppliant and a holy figure, in which the suppliant displays her piety, but at the same time is demonstrating her status by making a conspicuous offering that draws attention to both the achievements and the problems of her family. It's a rather different case from the examples we've looked at so far, but the emotion that is being expressed need not be the less deeply felt, though it's the emotion of an individual and not massed humanity. So this poem is an epigram, a short verse text in the 12-syllable line, which is intended to be inscribed, or in this case embroidered, on the object being offered, the icon, the veil. And it presents a prayer in the persona of Irene, which would be repeated on each viewing, when the viewer would join audibly or silently in the prayer which was first uttered by Irene. Now, sort of technical point, though expressed in the first person, it's most unlikely that Irene herself wrote this, though she had considerable literary interests. But she had a poet in her household who, over several decades, produced many similar texts and also many other writings. It's also an interesting question as to whether Irene herself embroidered the verses on the icon veil. If it was a metal object, one wouldn't expect to have done it, but women embroidered, so did she embroider this? Now, my second example in this context returns us to the monastic environment but keeps the female element. Next slide, please. I'm referring to a 14th century icon in the treasury of the Vatican Monastery. This small image, it's 25 by 22 centimetres, was dedicated to the Virgin of Sure Hope, Viver Helpis, by Anna Paleorigina Cantacuzini Philanthropini. In the 14th century, aristocratic names became very long. And the name is recorded in a now virtually illegible inscription on the wooden surface of the icon. There you can see the remnants of Anna's prostrate figure. The inscription beside the prostrate figure is now virtually illegible, but it was legible in the 18th century and recorded by the monastery librarian. The icon depicts an image of the Virgin embracing the Christ child with a battered silver revetment in which are revealed images of the archangels Michael and Gabriel, while plaques with figural reliefs and a dedicatory epigram are around the frame. Again, this was in the better condition in the 18th century, and a fuller version was read of what is on the icon now. The prostrate Anna was almost certainly the granddaughter of Theodora Paleorigina Sinarini, a niece of the Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologus, and she was a foundress of the convent of Sure Hope in Constantinople, a convent which is well known to art historians today because the magnificent foundation document for it, with a whole gallery of full-page depictions of its founder and her family, is in Lincoln College, Oxford. Now, I quote the text contained in the silver plaques surrounding the Virgin. Next slide, please. O maiden, sure hope of those in need, be my protection and the salvation of my soul, and wash away the dirt of my sins. I know that you are protector of both orphans and strangers. I, Anna Philanthropini, cry this out to you. Now, this battered text is Anna's prayer for salvation and plea for the washing away of her sins. The reference to orphans must allude to the orphanage for female children attached to the family's Constantinopolitan monastery. And indeed, by use of the phrase sure hope, Anna has identified herself as patroness, defined herself as patroness as much as she has defined the object of her veneration. The Virgin is the Virgin of Sure Hope, but Anna has established the convent of Sure Hope. Again, it could be said that a contract is being struck here. A gift is offered in anticipation of reciprocal blessings. But we're getting into slippery territory on which much more could be said and for which there is no time. The author of this text is presenting Anna as a repentant individual seeking salvation through the intervention of the Virgin. So, in conclusion, out of my limited capabilities, I've offered you a range of texts from the Byzantine monastic heritage. I've tried to give an idea of some of the backgrounds out of which this poetry emerged, in particular the pressures which led to its choice of form and style. I've used the terms poetry and verse to suggest that as literature, some of the texts are more effective, more ambitious than others, and I've tried to suggest that the authorial persona can be complex, perhaps a generic figure representing sinful humanity, perhaps an individual expressing unique experiences, perhaps a writer presenting another's hidden aspirations. In short, I've attempted to demonstrate some of the very different ways in which poetry can serve as prayer. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. If we're going to ask a question, could I ask you to stand up? Because it will actually make sure that everyone in the room actually can hear the question, which isn't always so easy. So if you have a question, please indicate to Nick and just stand and give it to us so that we can all hear it. I have one, to let the ball roll. How far do you consider these constructs are to do with being able to be memorised and the role of memory in their use and perpetuation?
Oh, I think it's very considerable.
Yes.
Particularly with the penitential alphabets.
Well, quite.
They are very memorable. They're in an easy form of verse. The rhythm works nicely, and I'm sure that accounts for their, particularly the Oranos one.
And do you think that accounts for the transition into the subsequent sort of verse structure you indicated? Is it a mode both of memorising and meditation on the one hand, but also in a way of advancing a certain literacy, do you think?
Probably a combination of everything.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
Because we see a similar thing in the West, of course,
right.
at this time, precisely the way.
What are you thinking
Well,
of?
I think of the movements from Alchem onward in the use of poetry
Right.
in this, in almost exact parallel to the examples and on into the 12th that you've given. It's fascinating to see the correlations, I think.
Certainly the 15th syllable line, the
Yes.
rumble one, which moves very smoothly, is used, I think, yes, certainly as a way of opening up a text
Yes.
subject to people.
Yes, fascinating. Was there a question? Max?
Do I have to stand?
Yes, you stand. So
I had a very simple question about the rendering of a word, but to pick up on what you were just saying, if I'm not mistaken, there's a communion prayer among the prayers said before communion in the Orthodox Church that must have been written by Simeon Metaphrastes, exactly like the one you showed. Of course, it talks about the Eucharist. And that's something that many Orthodox people have memorized because it's something that's repeated. So it's just to follow up on what you said. But I had a simple question though. The word, the first prayer by St. Theodore that you shared with us, the bedtime prayer, I was a little struck because the word there, the title of the prayer is Kimitirion, which is also the word for cemetery.
Absolutely, yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just comment on that, because that to me was not, I wasn't familiar with the equivocation there in the term, so.
Right, well, okay, yes. When I was looking for material, I find the Theodore epigrams for his monastic context rather appealing. They are very straightforward, and I picked this one because it seemed to be particularly tranquil. But yes, the title is striking, and I should have investigated, but I haven't. I didn't. Equally, on the question of phrases which appear either in the liturgy or come from it, I'm sure this sort of this type of verse is going to be not just Theodore, but generally full of references, which I haven't followed up to patristic writer, to the Psalms. It's going to be redolent of it. But yes, the cemetery reference is something which is very intriguing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found that most interesting, partly because of my own earlier studies in medieval Greek. There's also hymns by Simeon the New Theologian used in pre- and post-communion prayers, which personally, I have to say, I never use. I find them too personal. They strike me as prayers of his that are very hard to identify with. I don't know how other people find them. I'm wondering how far the writers of these prayers would have envisaged other people adopting them as their prayers.
That's an interesting question. I would have thought, in some circumstances, certainly. I'm sure Theodore, with the type of prayer that I produced, he was envisaging his monastic community, incorporating them into their daily life. Well, whereas Simeon was clearly completely exceptional person. He clearly was concerned for his community and their formation, but I'm equally certain that there were times when he was overwhelmed with his own personal insights, and he wasn't necessarily assuming that his insights were going to be taken up by the community. So I think there is no clear answer to your question.
Mm.
Thank you very much. Are Simeon's hymns hymns?
Yes, they are outpourings of his personal feelings, which he is offering as praise of his own. So personal hymns,
By definition, shouldn't there be music somewhere?
probably. But the title hymn was imposed by Nikitas de Athos, so he clearly thought there was a hymnic element. Now, I'm sure there should be music for a hymn to be a hymn.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. May I ask a question about Gregory Nazianzus? It's earlier than the ones.
Sorry?
It's earlier than the ones we've been talking about. But I just wondered, he would use a very high rhetoric style, sort of that was taught in the academias. And it's a similar question to the earlier one by Elizabeth. Was he using that to show off because he could? Or was that because it was part of the whole style of presenting an argument? In which case, would that be seen as a prayer? Would that be used for worship? Would that be used for, in that way?
Gregory is a very interesting case. I'm sure he was using a style which was natural to an educated man of his period. Natural in a way in which 6 centuries later, Geometries, it wasn't natural to. Geometries was making an effort to produce but I'm not saying that even in Geometries' case, the sentiments being expressed were not genuine, that he had a group of people around him who could participate, and I think, Demetrius disappeared, that there is evidence for music and that they were sung. Gregory is from the 4th century, highly literate, highly erudite, well versed in classical Greek and in the developing patristic thought. So I think this was his natural means of expression, in my view.
Rather mundane question, I'm afraid. I was very interested by the idea of the perfection of 10, the number of feet in a hexameter and a pentameter, excluding the 2 halves.
Yes.
But I thought it said that there were 6 dactyls.
Is that
Sorry, yes, 6 dactyls in a hexameter.
Hexameter. Yes, you can get.
But surely the last, the end of it is always a spondee or a
Right. Okay.
trochee.
Byzantine hexameter. The Byzantine metric was not always quite as conventional as it should be.
You could have a dactyl at the end of the
Yes.
hexameter.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was passing through my mind that prayer, or poetry in prayer, the notion of poetry being something that works a change, something that's made, as it were. Is the wish, do you think, to bring about a change in that which is objective, or the object of prayer, namely God or Christ or Our Lady, or is it something that brings about a greater change in us? What would you say in the context of some of these prayers was the underlying hope or wish in the prayer?
I would say on some occasion it's a wish to make the change in oneself. This is the prayers of compunction. The penitential alphabets are trying to urge the individual to change, to become more aware of their sins and repent. So there is the change. Moving on to the dedicatory epigrams, there is a change which is being wrought in the person who is being addressed. That yes, the person making the dedication will often acknowledge their sinfulness and penitence for the future, but also wishes the change they've wrought in themselves to bring a change in the holy person being addressed by performing a persuasive benefaction on or healing miracle or whatever. So I think both spheres. Thank you for the question.
One of your extracts, which we had, I think it was the second one, was strikingly similar to the Athos hymn.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could comment a little bit perhaps about the connection between the two, because I was not myself familiar really with the subject.
Right. Well, the Charisni, the hail.
Yes.
Well, yes. The Athos hymn is the supreme example of the hails. So this it is actually a bit of a tour de force that. For about 1,000 lines of verse spread over his 4 hymns, Geometries is producing variations on hail addressed to the Virgin.
Really?
Yes, yes.
And is this contemporary with the Athos hymn?
No, it isn't.
It's following on the example.
Yes, it's absolutely following on the example.
And is there a sort of genre of other prayers comparable in form to that?
Another, yes.
That's very interesting. I didn't realise that. Thank you very much.
Sorry to come back again, just to point out, apropos of Gregory the theologian, this will be known to many people here, but perhaps not all, that a number of his, not of his own hymns, but of his very rhetorical sermons, large chunks of them are incorporated verbatim into many of the Orthodox liturgical texts,
Right, yes,
especially
yes,
by John of Damascus and
Yes.
Cosmas.
Yes.
And a liturgical example of this same phenomenon of archaic languages is the quite extraordinary iambic canons for Christmas, Theophany and Pentecost, which are both liturgical prayers and highly, I would really say, artificial literary creations.
Right. Yes. Yes, the language of the iambic canons could also have been used for instructional purposes. So we have someone here in the audience who is very, very well aware.
Was it done?
Is that done?
Done.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for those two evenings.